This is your host of CivilNet, and we are honored today to be joined by our guest all the way from UNLV, Las Vegas, Nevada, Professor Nerses Kopalyan. And we're going to be interviewing him today about this fascinating op-ed that he has written in EBN Report, and it's called Resolving the Problem of Nagorno-Karabakh's Sovereignty, the Limitations of Remedial Secession, and the Need for Remedial Sovereignty. Before we get started, I sort of wanted to give a sort of a universal background. We'll see if you agree with me, and then we'll move on from there. I think when you're looking at the issue of Artsakh at this point, there's essentially three variables. There's what I call the Aliyev Erdogan variable, which is an ethnically cleansed Artsakh of any Armenians that goes back into the control of the Azeri regime. Essentially ethnic cleansing, and if need be, genocide to achieve that. The second option is some kind of a formal freezing of the current situation into something permanent. And the third one is some kind of a earned sovereignty, remedial secession, however you want to put it, in which the international community, recognizing that the intentions of the Azeri regime are genocidal, goes in there, puts its foot down, and separates that part entirely legally out of any legal sovereignty of the Azeri regime. I think that's the universal approach, the reality of the three options we're dealing with. I want to talk to you about your particular concept that you came up with this remedial sovereignty. And obviously, you write in very high academic prose, so we want to make this simple for everyone to be able to understand. In layman's terms, what does your concept mean?
Of course, the concept isn't originally mine. It has been utilized in the international legal scholarship and political scholarship to some extent in explaining the developments that we saw in Kosovo after Kosovo was provided or given sovereignty, recognized as sovereign. And so the concept is not too complicated in that sense. It observes developments and notes that an indigenous population is being threatened, existentially threatened by a host state. So in our case, it would be the indigenous Armenian population of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, that is being threatened by the Aliyev regime, by the state of Azerbaijan. So there's a consensus that this population is threatened and is at the verge of being ethnically cleansed or massacred should there not be protection for this community. How do you address that? One approach is to basically guarantee the security of these people by allowing them to secede from the host state. Thus, secession becomes a remedy to the problem, hence the concept of remedial secession. Of course, the problem with remedial secession is that it's inherently territorial. It becomes about separating territories as opposed to addressing specifically the existential threat that the given population suffers from. And so to mitigate the international concern about opening up a Pandora's box and everybody requiring secession, so on and so forth, the concept of earned or phased sovereignty was introduced. And this is where the international community steps in. They guarantee the security of the given indigenous population, and then there's a process, a phased process where the given population is protected and allowed to earn its sovereignty by demonstrating self-governance, institution building, so on and so forth. This is the notion of remedial sovereignty, where sovereignty becomes the remedy to the existential threat that the given population is suffering from or being threatened by. And so in very nutshell terms, that is what the concept entails.
Okay, that's a very good explanation. But specifically, the primary difference between this and remedial secession, which was the Kosovo model, which a lot of Westerners have, are phobic about because,
right.
You raise the issue, they'll tell you it's a one-time exception. It can never be repeated, which on one level is understandable, on another level is ridiculous, because once you do something once, then there's repeat scenarios.
That's precedent, right.
So in layman's terms, what is the exact difference at the end is what? Is this a longer process? Is this a process in which at the end does not lead to complete separation? That there's some sort of a legal or diplomatic limbo that you stay in at a special status without completely separating from the host nation that wants to commit?
So there are differences as far as how the protocol and the procedure would take place. Kosovo had distinct features as far as population size, the threat that they faced from the Milosevic regime, and other dynamics that they were involved. In the case of Artsakh, one could argue that the situation is a lot more severe because you do have an instituted state policy by Azerbaijan that inherently demonizes every component of Armenianness. So in that context, when we're talking about a political culture, a political system, and a leadership that is set on harming a certain minority population, protecting that population in this instant is going to be somewhat different than how the Kosovars were protected previously. But the differences, contextually speaking, pertain to the effects on the ground. But overarchingly, from the lens of international law and from the lens of protecting a minority population, it's not that different. And this isn't only specific to Kosovo. Let us bring up the example of the Yazidis that were threatened by ISIS, right? You had an indigenous population that was being threatened, and there was an attempt at a genocide. This is where the international community stepped in to protect them. So conceptually, what we're talking about at this point is you have an indigenous population that is being threatened by a host state. And what the remedial sovereignty process does is that it interjects the international community that initially provides protection for that community and then begins a phased process of remedying that situation. And accepting the fact that there has been no solution to the problem for 30 years, accepting the fact that negotiations aren't going anywhere, and there's an international legal concept called exhaustion negotiations, which becomes one of the triggers for remedial sovereignty, which has been achieved at this point. All indicators, all criteria and threshold per international law have been met to trigger remedial sovereignty. So in this context, the developments, the situation might have been different from Kosovo as far as the facts on the ground and the modality of threat that the population faced. But overarchingly, the fact of the matter is you have an indigenous population that is threatened, right? And existing international institutions and instruments exist that could protect that population. And so the concept of remedial sovereignty offers a roadmap to addressing this issue.
That's a very good answer. Thank you. When we're looking at the past year, 14 months, essentially since September 27th on, when I look at your concept, when you look at the Aliyev regime and everything that comes out of that, the state that he is essentially the state for all practical purposes. He has done everything over the last year to prove your point. From building the Nazi hate park, putting out the stamps showing the extermination of the Armenians of Artsakh, holding POWs illegally, committing all kinds of war crimes, cultural genocide on a scale not seen since ISIS. Has he been doing our work for us in making the case that you are outlining?
He has clearly put forth a lot of empirical relevant facts and reference that can be utilized without a need to counter or present narratives, and these are very, very straightforward in supporting the claim that indeed this is a genocidal regime. Aliyev in that context has done a lot of the legwork in proving that his government cannot protect and will not protect the indigenous population. And of course, there's a large body of evidence to support that. The recent filings by Armenia with the International Court of Justice, all the evidence that was produced is a case in point. So you do make a very good point in that Aliyev has done the work for us in proving and demonstrating that he is what he is and he's a threat to this population. From the lens of the international community, we have not seen any international actor attempt to basically contradict the premise that Aliyev is a dictator and a threat to these people, to the Armenian population. So within that framework, you're definitely right. He has done a lot of the work for us. But the extent to which Armenia or Armenians have consistently and methodically utilized what Aliyev has given to the Armenian nation by virtue of his vulgar fascism, that is a whole different issue. And I think that is something that needs to be tapped into because the body of evidence is there. And he keeps producing all this evidence for us to demonstrate the threat that his regime is to the Armenian people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had recently a conversation with a Western diplomat who's assigned to multiple countries. As you know, many countries have their ambassadors in Tbilisi, and they go back and forth. And I made the case that, in fact, there's pressure on Aliyev from his population or people who are whoever opposes the regime, in which they're criticizing him for not achieving complete ethnic cleansing. So what you really have in that case is not only this racialized neo-fascist type regime, but a regime that has so poisoned its own people with this narrative or this hateful Nazi type narrative that there's really no recourse outside of what we're discussing here. Let's move on to, obviously, these steps. There's a legal mechanism. What is the legal mechanism, and what are the venues used to make the case and to push this forward?
So with remedial sovereignty, what we're doing here, conceptually, when this concept is being proposed, is that we are removing the Republic of Armenia out of the equation. What we're seeing is that you have this indigenous population that is being threatened by Azerbaijan. Armenia cannot address this issue, and clearly Azerbaijan's resolution to this issue is what it is, the killing and the cleansing of this population. And so by removing the Republic of Armenia out of the equation and saying this is specific to an ethnic population that is protection, we are also removing territoriality from the discourse. And thus telling the international community, listen, whether they're Armenian or whether they're this or that, you have this population that is being threatened by a fascist state. What are you going to do about it? Okay, and this is where the international legal instruments are utilized. Usually the way a phased sovereignty works is that the UN Security Council gives a mandate to a given international institution or given states within the UN Security Council to do it's a two-tiered process. One, physical security is provided. In the case of Kosovo, NATO went in. In the case of Artsakh, the Russians are already there, right? So the Russian peacekeepers are basically what stands between genocide and the current status quo that we have. So physical security is the first step that the UN mandates, Security Council mandates. In this instance, the Russian peacekeepers would receive a UN mandate to continue what they're doing, keeping the peace. Of course, the extent to which the numbers would grow, would decrease, maybe other actors would get involved, that is open to logistical issues and so on and so forth. Fundamentally, though, the first mechanism is giving the UN mandate, giving security. The second is providing humanitarian, administrative, and state building assistance to the indigenous population. And this is where the European Union, the various UN agencies, and the international community gets involved. The important thing about this is that Russians for some time have been appealing to the international community to partake. So we are seeing an important alignment of interests where which remedial sovereignty could become a potential reality. And so procedurally, the way this would work is the UN Security Council, noting the danger that the indigenous population is facing, will vote to basically give the Minsk group a broader mandate. And consider the fact that 3 members of the Minsk group, Russia, US, and France, are also part of the UN Security Council, there's a consistency and continuity in activity. And so procedurally would be the initial process of providing a mandate where which the population is protected, followed by the phased sovereignty process where you have administrative supervision, state building, state government, and so on and so forth. So that is the process. And conceptually, we are approaching this mechanism because to a very large extent, we see that Baku has disregarded the ONCE Minsk group. And very recently in Sweden, their foreign minister even refused to sit down with Armenia's foreign minister within the framework of the Minsk group. What Azerbaijan is saying is, I've resolved this issue on my own. I don't recognize an issue, which isn't the case as far as the international community is concerned. And more specifically, what Azerbaijan is saying is the ONCE Minsk group is no longer relevant because this group was designed to address the Artsakh issue. And he's saying, I don't see an issue. So there's a lot of incoherence in Baku's posturing, which the international community says that's not how it works. there actually is a population there whose issue has not been resolved. And so the mechanism of having both UN mandated peacekeepers and also a UN structured humanitarian administrative process, these are the mechanisms through which remedial sovereignty and phase sovereignty is achieved.
Well, I think obviously none of these things happen outside of a political vacuum. And the one politically attractive thing here for many of the actors, this is actually one of the places in which there actually can be, at a time where there's all kinds of conflicts in Ukraine and other places, this is a place where you can actually build consensus, and a place in which Russian peacekeepers are actually, viewed in a very positive light, in the sense that they're the tripping line between genocide and not genocide. So I think this is politically attractive for many different reasons for many different countries. One of the things that I'm afraid that one of the problems that we always face, and this is rather it's an upside down world, we're the victims of Islamophobia, because there's a different standard for us. Well, there's a different standard for our enemies. I can only imagine if Vladimir Putin had put out a stamp showing that he's cleansed Abkhazia of Georgians, what the international reaction would be. We saw what Aliyev did, and there was no reaction. If the Serbs had built a park the way Baku did, what the reaction would be. And I think what this is, and this is very distinctly Northern European. It's the Germans, the English, the Dutch. That's that world of people in which they think being progressive is being, making excuses for Islamic or Oriental regimes, and it's really the tyranny of low expectations. So they won't say it, but there's a higher standard for Russians, Serbs, and Armenians. But the Turks are doing ethnic cleansing 100 years in the same place after they did it. Well, they're barbarians and savages anyway. So they get away with it. How do we fight this Islamophobia and this double standard that not only harms us, actually harms the people of places like Azerbaijan and Turkey, who have these regimes that Europeans keep making excuses for rather than demanding the highest standards?
Right. Well, there is inherently political culture colonialism that defines a lot of Northern Europe. And so as the sort of sectors of the world, right, that the given powers that for years abused and exploited the given population, especially the Muslim populations throughout their history, their sympathy is more contingent upon them justifying their behavior as opposed to actually caring about these people. And in that context, I do fundamentally agree with you that by saying we're very sympathetic to them because they're somehow beneath us, or they need our sympathy, or we need to treat them with sort of, white gloves, the question is, you do view them to be beneath you. And therefore, you have the viewpoint that you do. And so this whole notion of having sympathy towards the Islamic populations of the given countries by the Northern Europeans isn't so much about those populations itself, but rather about the European way of thinking to kind of self-justify, or at least to deal with colonial guilt. Why is that a problem for us? Well, since the fall of the Soviet Union, right, most cases of ethnic cleansing have been towards Muslim populations. And so this whole instance of a Christian population being potentially ethnically cleansed, or steps being taken to ethnically cleanse a Christian population, does not have much precedent. So countries like Germany, like the UK, find it difficult to accept the fact that a Christian population can actually be ethnically cleansed, where the trend traditionally has been given powers doing it.
And Kosovo.
Exactly. Or even with the Yazidi population, and so on and so forth. So what we need to do is basically there needs to be a de-religiousization of the whole discourse on ethnic cleansing. And the fact that Armenians are being qualified as relatively being a successful, historically high civilizational people, having high culture and so on and so forth, and how can these people be ethnically cleansed? That's some kind of alien concept from the European colonial viewpoint. That in itself is problematic. And so what we're seeing is The general perspective is, yes, most ethnic cleansing, genocides that we've seen in recent history have been towards Muslim populations. So they're not really used to seeing this towards Christian populations, even though religion isn't driving what we're talking about. But fundamentally, their modality of thinking basically is the following. If they're Muslim and there might be ethnic cleansing, it's a red flag. If they're not Muslim, there might be an ethnic cleansing. Let's see what happens. Well, the problem is that phase of let's see what happens could be inherently tragic. And that is what we're fighting and trying to address at this point.
Well, I appreciate your response. I appreciate the work that you do, and thank you for joining us today. It was a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure.
This is your host of CivilNet, Eric Hacopian. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.